Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well. I'm glad to see all of you, and just want to first, before I say anything and forget anything more and forget, I want to express my appreciation for you all being patient. We were scheduled to begin at 9:30. We're about 4 or 5 minutes behind. We're waiting on a friend, but it occurred to us that we can get going without the friend because the friend doesn't have to come up here until a short while later. So we're going to get going. Good deal? Good to see all of you. I'm Jennifer Jones Austin. A lot of friends and family in the room, and I'm grateful for that. And even if you don't consider yourself family or friends, soon you will be after this, right? Does that sound good? Let me first tell you that I am feeling encouraged by you all being here this morning. Very often people don't come out for the would-be wonky conversations, right? But wonky conversations matter. They matter because if you don't get up under the what's what, if we only look at the bright, the flashing signals and the bells and whistles, then we don't really have an appreciation, hey, for what's going on and how we can affect change. We wouldn't be here. Let me just say, we would not be in this room having a conversation about fiscal policy if it were not for the human services agencies and the human services sector. It was back in the first Trump administration that member agencies of FPWA were very alarmed, very concerned about the changes that were being planned, that were being proposed with respect to cuts in critical services for individuals and families. And in that moment, as we were listening to member agencies and others talk about their concerns, we at FPWA were appreciating there was no way of really tracking the flow of federal funds from the federal government all the way down to community-based organizations. We were surprised when we began digging to find out that the city did not have a tool, did not have the capacity for doing so. The state did not have the capacity, did not have the tool. And so we engaged with the New York Community Trust and with their support, created what then was the Federal Funds Tracker. And we began by working with looking at the flow of funds to just 4 agencies in New York City. Help me, Brad, help me, Emily. Namely, it was ACS. Let's see, we had ACS was the Department of Health and Mental Health, DSS, HRA, and HPD, right? So we began looking at those 4 agencies. Then we began, we realized that that's where a lot of critical federal funding was coming in, but there were other agencies we needed to look at. We began looking at state agencies and how the flows fund with the New York City Human Services Tracker. And then we went the next step and just began looking all across at city agencies, looking at city funds, state funds, and federal funds to figure out how the money was flowing, where they were tightening up. If money wasn't coming from the federal government, how it was tightening up at the state, same thing federal, state to city, to see the impact on agencies and then government agencies, and then in turn on community-based organizations receiving funds from the agencies. I don't have to tell you, the impact is huge. It's alarming, and the impact is only growing. Now, under this current federal administration, the threats are ever present, they're ever growing, they're ever looming. I was talking with my daughter, and I said to her, and she's in the health policy space, I said, it's almost as if they want people to die. And she looked at me and she said, they do. Like, that's part of the plan. When you start cutting out critical services, when you pause funding for food supports, when you cut critical services or you plan to cut critical services and programming like Medicaid, people are going to die. So let's not be fooled and think that death is not part of the plan. Maybe if you're the majority and you're concerned about the minority becoming the majority, one of the ways that you get at that is by killing people off. May sound alarming, may sound conspiratorial in nature, but I don't think we should just believe that they just haven't thought about this. they haven't figured it out. So when I was a little girl, I'm one of 4 children, I'm the youngest. My father, who was a justice warrior, he was a revolutionary. He used to preach. He was a pastor, and he would say that, in this world we've got religion all wrong, that if you follow the teachings of God, and if you're a Christian, you follow the teachings of Christ, then you have to appreciate that they were justice warriors, and they were centered not on charity alone, but on justice work as well. In his preaching and his teaching to his children especially, he would tell us all the time, gain knowledge, gain power. Gain knowledge, gain power. And what he was helping us to appreciate is that if you have knowledge, if you have facts, if you can substantiate the facts that you have with evidence and with data, then you're not just talking out of your head. The thing about that, though, is it makes you more dangerous, right? The reason why we've got so many rollbacks in so many different places and spaces, the reason why they're threatening to cut the Department of Education, right? The federal government, the federal executive branch, wants to get rid of the Department of Education is not because it necessarily controls all of education in America, but it controls and is there to ensure equality in education, that all children will receive a quality public education experience. If that is gone, if you cut that out, then you have a greater ability to prevent those who've long been marginalized from gaining knowledge, and then with it, gaining power. The power to fight back, to resist, to challenge systems and structures, to challenge the rollback of critical funding. So I'm heartened that you're all here today. Again, this work began. It was the rising up of the human services agencies saying we need to do something about this. In the room today are human service agency leaders. In the room today, we have partners in philanthropy. We have partners who are advocates in the space, working on behalf of people who are struggling and in need, and the agencies that represent them. And of course, we have FPWA staff who are doing the work to make sure that you all have the knowledge, so that what? If you have knowledge, then you have power, and you can resist. So what we're going to do this morning, because we all have to, in this moment, let me just say this and then I'm going to get off my soapbox. Years ago, there was a movie that came out about the Harlem Children's Zone, Jeff Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone. Do you all remember that movie, any of you? Did you see it? It's worth seeing. It's titled Waiting for Superman. It's titled Waiting for Superman, and essentially, Jeff Canada, who founded the Harlem Children's Zone, in the opening, and actually throughout the film, he speaks about how we live in these communities. Many of us live in communities that have been marginalized. We're part of communities that have been discriminated against, that have been kept from opportunity. And he was really speaking in the education, but particularly in education and the environments in which a lot of Black and brown children persist in highly segregated schools in New York City and beyond. And he said that he too, growing up in the Bronx, found himself in such an environment. And he said he was always led to believe that at some point Superman was going to show up. And Superman was going to save the day. And so he realized at one point that there really is no Superman. There really is no one person who's going to save us. A lot of people right now are looking at federal congressional leaders. The back and forth that we saw over the course of the last week with respect to the spending bill, the Senate minority leader going with it, and then the House minority leader not going with it, and now the tension, right, and the infighting and the question about, well, who's leading in this moment to fight back? And we're all like, we're without a leader. In Waiting for Superman, what we are helped to appreciate is that there is no one leader. Nobody's just going to come and save us. We have to do the work to ensure that we work together collectively and that we save ourselves and the people for whom we care. So the work that we're going to talk about today, the issues that we're going to center on today, are all about gaining the knowledge so that we can fight against the forces that are taking back critical funds that are needed. I'm just going to call it, not just for the marginalized, but more and more, all of us. Those tax cuts that are being proposed, they affect many of us in this room. The ones who benefit are the ones who are like at the $1 million level plus, who are going to have bank after that. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to make sure, first and foremost, that we do some level setting, that we all have a really good sense with the work of Brad Martin and Emily Pisano, I did it. Positano, I don't know where that came from. Forgive me, Emily. But they're going to first walk us through the research and the data and what it tells us about our current state, as well as what it tells us about the threatened future state and how it will impact New York City with respect to critical services. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with some friends in the space who are very much engaged in the work of figuring out what does this mean for community and what we can do from our respective vantage points to resist. I've said a lot, but I think we're all in the same place now, right? What are we here to do? We're going to gain some, and with it, we're going to gain some power, and we're going to fight back. I'll get out the way.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Great to see everyone here today. I'm very excited to meet some of you in the room today, see some familiar faces, and just chat with everyone. I want to thank Jennifer, first of all, for her words in this moment and her leadership. And reflects what we're fighting for here at FPWA. We believe that this service sector should have real power and that New Yorkers should have the ability not only to get by, but to thrive. So as the Fiscal Policy Team, just want to introduce us as the Fiscal Policy Team. I'm Emily Pisano, Fiscal Policy Analyst here at FPWA.
I'm Brad Martin, Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst.
And what we think about on a daily basis is how New York City's budget can reflect the vision of New York of power. So as we think about this vision, we already can reflect on where we are today. And I don't need to tell people in the room today that communities and human services agencies are struggling. And each year we are part of this budget fight. We try to fight for budget equity, looking not only at who and how New York City allocates its resources, but who and how it gets its resources from. But every year we find that this budget fight is an uphill battle. And we wanted to look at the underlying causes of why this budget fight is so hard. And part of a key reason why this budget fight is so hard is a lack of budget transparency. Understanding New York City's budget, even for budget experts, is needlessly complex, and it prevents community members here today from actually understanding what's happening to community funding. And it prevents us from coming together to fight for the resources that we know that we need. So here at FPWA, as Jennifer mentioned, we've been thinking about how we can get the knowledge to promote our own power. And we've developed a few data tools that we're hoping to talk to you today. Specifically today we're going to talk about the New York City Funds Tracker and how it can help shed light on the context and the budgetary moment we find ourselves in, and how it can help us develop better policy solutions for the future.
So as Emily said, we think it's really important that we all understand the New York City budget. it impacts all of us as human services agencies. It impacts the amount of funding that's available to fund city contracts. It also impacts all of us as people living in New York, just on an individual level. We think it's particularly important this year with the federal context with threats of funding cuts and some threats that have already been made real. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty around funding, and a lot of this uncertainty is intentional. So what we want to do today is to talk about what we do know. We'll do this by using our NYC funds tracker, but before we get into the detail on that, Emily's just going to give us a bit of background.
So Jennifer kindly talked to some of the history that makes up our New York City funds tracker. As you said, this work started back in the first Trump administration, where we were experiencing similar but different threats, where federal cuts were coming down to local funding. Since then, FPWA has developed this tool, with last year releasing a interactive dashboard that helps advocates, ask and interact with these budget questions. This year, and actually today, we're releasing an updated version of the New York City Funds Tracker, which really expands the functionality for advocates. We're really excited for what that can, provide for you here in the room today, and I'll let Brad speak a little bit more about what that looks like.
So what we're launching today is a new NYC funds tracker. Since we first launched the funds tracker a year ago, we've been talking to some of you in the room and other budget advocates about what we can do to make the tool even more useful. And what we've done now is we've added in information for every city agency. So it gives you a holistic view of the city budget. If you want to know about funding from any agency down to the granular level of even if it's an individual community board, you can now go into the tracker and find that information, find information about specific federal grants, and then also look at how agencies are spending that funding. We've also redesigned the dashboard to make it a more user-friendly experience. We're not going to dwell too much on the dashboard itself today, but I encourage everyone after the event, get online and check it out. Encourage your staff to have a look at it because it's a really useful tool for exploring the budget. What we are going to do today, though, is look at what it tells us about the current state of the city budget. So what we're going to do is explore three main themes that we see come out. Firstly, we'll have a look at the city's revenue and what's driving some trends there. We'll look at how the city has responded to rising need in the city by exploring human services budgets on the expenditure side. And then finally, we'll take a deep dive into some key federal grants such as TANF and SNAP. These are really vital for funding things like food supports and cash assistance.
So if we take a deeper dive into revenue, you can see here on the right a screenshot from the New York City Funds Tracker. We see that the revenue pressures that we're feeling today actually precede the current federal administration. When we look at the budget, we see revenue stagnating with adjusted for inflation about a $4 billion decline in revenue from FY21. And when we take a deeper dive into that revenue data, splitting between city, state, and federal sources, we see that a driving source behind this decrease in federal in revenue is a decrease in federal grants. But if we take even a deeper dive into the data, we see that this is not the only pressure on the city's revenue base. In fact, there are some signs of pressures on the city's tax base that are caused by an uneven pandemic recovery. So if we look at take a look at personal income taxes, we can see evidence of a strained middle class with a 14% decrease in personal income taxes from FY19 to FY24. This is pretty significant when we appreciate the fact that personal income taxes make up around over 12% of the city's overall budget.
So despite these revenue pressures, when we look over to the expenditure side, we are pleased to see some recent increases in funding for the city's human services agencies. But when we consider this in the context of the increased level of need that we've seen in the city over the past few years, we can see that the funding is still relatively modest. So over this same period, we've seen an increase in the number of people accessing vital support. So we've seen the number of people receiving SNAP increase by 15%, Medicaid's up 25%, and the number of people receiving cash assistance is up 50%. And we know that it's not only those that are doing it toughest that are feeling the pinch. We know from our recent work on economic security that 62% of New Yorkers don't have the resources that they need to thrive. And so when you consider the level of need and economic insecurity in the city, the funding to human services is still quite modest.
And so despite the acute need that Brad spoke to, we actually see a decrease in the amount of federal grants, particularly for certain human services funding. We can see here some snapshots from the New York City Funds Tracker looking at SNAP funding and TAMP funding. We can see that there's been a 23% decline in SNAP funding when adjusted for inflation, and almost a 40% decline in TAMP when adjusted for inflation. And this is all to give us all this information to give us the current state before we even factor in the additional federal threats that Jennifer has helped us to appreciate. Just to recount a little bit what we're facing, the Trump administration has come out swinging and has already tried to claw back already allocated funds to New York City. We're talking about $80 million that Elon Musk rescinded from New York City's bank accounts in response to their asylum seeker support. And these targeted attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on our community here, on immigrants, are only escalating, and I think we've seen that in the last few weeks. But coming down the pipeline, what this adds up to is a budget for billionaires and not for families. Just last week, Congress passed a continuing resolution that cuts around $13 billion in non-defense spending, and it fails to, allocate the additional funding that we know that we need, just in terms of inflation, but more so in terms of the rising need that Brad is speaking to. And this also gives Congress, and the Republicans the ability to continue to build their coalition for tax cuts for the billionaires and cuts for benefits for Americans and for New Yorkers here. Just to give you a little bit, appreciate some of the things that are proposed in the budget. The House budget has proposed, increased work requirements for SNAP, huge decreases to TAMP, around 10% of the budget, and even eliminating the social services block grant altogether, which is a huge, vital source of local funding.
So what does this all mean? It means that the city budget is already constrained, and that's even before the threat of these federal cuts. So we don't want to be too doom and gloom. It is, quite a tricky or difficult situation that we find ourselves in, but by being informed, we can come together to respond. In terms of what we will be doing, we continue to call for city leadership to focus on economic security. and also want to highlight the importance of, in our advocacy work, ensuring that the voices of the people that we're supporting are heard. So we're about to have a very exciting panel discussion where we're going to explore some of these issues a little bit more. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to take a moment to pause to see if anyone has any questions about what Emily and I have covered, or if people have any reflections that they would like to add at this point.
One quick question about the scaling numbers you had on the cash assistant. Do you have a sense, is it New York statewide or New York City? I'm thinking of whether like is unique to New York City or whether it's statewide that the state cannot really like talk about how
So there's a couple problems with the TAMP block grant that the federal government provides. It's never been inflation adjusted, so all states, right, are experiencing the decline in the real amount of money that is being allocated. So that's writ large. And I think, there's warranted to kind of do a little bit more research about why these numbers have fallen in New York by so much. The TAMP is a block grant that helps support cash assistance as well as other family benefit programs. And so there's some variables in terms of, the federal government having provided alternative benefit programs that have during the COVID pandemic that helped raise people out of poverty temporarily, which may have increased the amount of, changed the amount of people applying. It also could be that less people, that need these supports are actually receiving them. We know that from the city that there's just a huge backlog, and while there's a huge increase in the amount of cash assistance requests, that they're not receiving these benefits in a timely manner.
like Medicaid and SNAP and cash assistance?
So it's just TAMP. TAMP is so what I'm speaking to is a block grant that supports cash assistance, a specific benefit program. It also supports several other benefit programs, but its main one is cash assistance.
We can try using the mic if you like.
Thank you both. Sorry if you said this and I missed it, but I know things are moving fast at the federal level. Is the tracker going to be updated in real time to try to keep track of policy changes and cuts that are happening?
So the tracker is a backwards look at city funding. It uses data released by the Comptroller's Office, which looks at actuals. So we see it as a piece that provides context about what has happened. We are also releasing today a new series called NYC Budget Watch, which is on our website, and that looks more at the budgets that the city is releasing in real time, which will go to some of what is happening now. So it's probably just one piece that we would use as part of a broader suite of information in terms of responding to this.
If I may just say, so what you're saying is that the tracker looks at what has happened for perspective, but we're going to be in real time, keeping track of what is happening and providing updates.
Could you speak a little bit to the reason why there's that 12% decrease in personal income tax revenue to the city?
So there has been some interesting, reports that have been put out actually by, Fiscal Policy Institute and the Center for New York City Affairs. That speaks to some of the reasons that we see this degrading personal income tax. What we believe is that we don't think this is coming from, the wealthy leaving New York. Actually, we see that out migration from New York is the lowest, actually net zero, from 2023. And what we see is middle-class New Yorkers leaving New York. If we appreciate the numbers of middle-income jobs that have been lost, there's about a 5% decline in middle-income jobs from New York City. That's 76,000 jobs. So when you see an increase in the amount of wealth, but that is not collected by personal income tax, they get their money from capital gains mainly, and a thinning middle class, there's going to be strain on that personal income revenue that's generated.
Okay, I think we might move on to the panel discussion, which I'm personally very excited about. I think the people that we have on this panel are leaders in the fiscal policy, funding, philanthropy space. I think I speak for both of us when I say we don't go a day without reading one of the reports or publications that these organizations release. And so I'll hand back over to Jennifer and our panel now.
Thank you, Brad and Emily, for your presentation. And more significantly, for the great work that you all are doing and leading for all of us. So I'm going to ask our panelists to come up front. And as they do, I just want us to pick up on the question and the conversation being had. But come on up, about the middle class. It may strike you as strange for FPWA, an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization, to tell you that we cannot just center in this moment on those who are classified as poor. That this is a both-and situation, where we have to center on those who are classified as low income and those who would be classified according to outdated traditional poverty measures as middle income. We cannot, this is not an us versus them in this moment. This is, we're all in this together. We greatly depend upon the resources of the middle class community to help us thrive. And in turn, we're finding, the fact of the matter is, I live in Brooklyn, and I live in a house that my family was fortunate, just to give you just an example of what this looks like on a daily basis. And Helen knows this. I live in a house that my family was fortunate to buy in 1976, right? Like nearly 50 years ago. And in my neighborhood, what I see increasingly, well, let me first tell you, there has not been a family of color to buy on my block since 2002. Low and would-be middle class. I have some friends whose niece graduated from medical school, her fiance from business school. After about 2 or 3 years of marrying, I should say husband now, they wanted to buy a house. They could not afford to buy a house on our block. And we see increasingly that it's out of reach for middle income Americans. This was a middle class community. It's entirely out of reach. And so we have to, in this moment, figure out how we do both and. And one of the reasons why we're going to center right now on economic security is because it is a bit of the both and. There was a time when in America you could move easily from being what is classified as low income into the middle income bracket. That doesn't happen in the way that it used to. We did some research here at FPWA that helped us appreciate that when we center on how people are struggling today, interestingly, people who are classified as low income, who are able to receive critical income supports, don't necessarily worry about the in the moment. If they have childcare, if they're fortunate to have childcare, if they're fortunate to have food supports, if they're fortunate to be able to draw down housing subsidies. And we don't know how long that good fortune is going to hold. Let's just be clear about that, right? We don't know how long, if you call that good fortune. But we're seeing increasingly that people who are classified as middle income, they can't make ends meet. Maybe they're okay with putting food on the table, keeping a roof over their head, but they can't save for their children's futures. They can't save for retirement. And low and middle income people increasingly cannot weather an economic storm, especially here in New York. They cannot lose their jobs and go a month or 2, 3, 4 as they search for a new job and be able to stay and pay their rent and keep food on the table. They cannot have a medical emergency that requires them to do something out of pocket or out of network, I should say, and then in turn out of pocket and be able to meet all of their basic needs. So we have to look at the both ends. And we think that if we center on economic security, we're going to make sure we leave nobody behind. So what our panel is going to do is talk with us just about these very issues. As we are living in a city where we're seeing the erosion of critical funds and income supports for families in need, and we're seeing that our revenues are dissipating in significant manner, we need to talk about what is the work to be done and by whom, and what is the role that we all can play. And so we have a very exciting panel, and I've done a lot of talking this morning. I'm going to blame Dr. Jocelyn Rainey because I called her at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we talked until about 8:15 maybe, and so she got me going. Meaning like you don't normally talk that much that early in the morning, but now I'm just blah, 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 blah. Let me just quickly mention that one of our board members is here. Carrie, would you give a wave? Thank you for being with us this morning. So, a great panel, and all will provide very informed perspective. To my right, I have an individual who I've been hanging with now for how long? I think we've been hanging together since maybe 2006. I think that's where we came together in City Hall. And interestingly, we came together and a lot of the work that we were centering on was economic opportunity for New Yorkers. Together we worked on the Commission for Economic Opportunity, which became the Center for Economic Opportunity. She's responsible for all the lead efforts to establish 311 in the city. She has a name. Her name is Louisa Chafee, and she has another job today. She serves as the director of the New York City Independent Budget Office. And she, along with Krista, made possible that I now too serve on the Independent Budget Office. But she's the director of that organization, government policy and operations expert, 2 decades plus of leadership experience in both government and the nonprofit sector, at the state level and at the city level. And she is, how can I best say this? She is a make it happen person. She's a guru on processes and systems and structures. She's also a big disruptor. And so Louisa Chafee, I'm glad to have you here.
It's a negative word.
No, disruptor is good. We want
Change.
Newest friend, I said that we're going to have some new friends by the end of this gathering. Nathan Guzdoff, and he is the director of the Fiscal Policy Institute. I understand that you are a tax attorney, which
That's right.
we all need you in this moment. Can you help us who would we not be in the more affluent space on a sidebar to find those loopholes that would actually benefit us? Maybe?
We'll be here for a very long time.
Good to have you here. Krista Olson, Deputy Comptroller for the budget for New York City Comptroller's Office. I've had the pleasure of being in her space on many times. She's been very helpful to us here at FPWA and to me. Glad you're here. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to you bringing to this conversation is your perspective on fiscal management, analysis, oversight, because in this particular moment, I think we all can agree, we need checks and balances. Nothing, we can't let anything get by, especially as it comes, when it comes to fiscal policy in this moment. So I'm glad that you're here. And as I just said, she certainly isn't last, because I would not have spent an hour plus on the phone with her this morning. just a great friend, and for all of you all to know and appreciate, a tremendous leader. She being Dr. Jocelyn Rainey, has served in leadership for several years. Some of you may know her from her days at Brooklyn Navy Yard, where she really centered on helping to develop economic opportunity. From that space in Brooklyn, New York, like just helping it to grow into a thriving space, providing economic opportunity for individuals, low-income individuals, people just getting started. She made her mark there. But then she went to GOSO, and she engaged with individuals re-entering society, young people, and put her mark there. Now she's just like gangbusters over at Brooklyn.org, leading in the philanthropic space in a way that I'm just going to say is unprecedented, truly unprecedented, here in New York and beyond. At Brooklyn.org, she has raised funds that have surpassed the $130 million mark, and she keeps telling the board, the community, the city and beyond, that this is that moment where philanthropy should not be shying away, but rather engaging all the more in fighting injustice, especially racial injustice. So we've got a great panel, and we're going to lean in, and we're going to learn. We're going to do what? We're going to gain some knowledge, and with it, we're going to gain
Power.
Thank you. Power. So I'm going to begin. Question for all of you. We've talked, I've talked, Emily and Brad have talked. I'm sure everybody in this room at some point or many points has talked about the federal policies coming down from the Trump administration, the way that they've gone into the budget and have sought to make cuts and pauses as though they actually are the only ones with authority to do so, that they don't have to go through Congress and go through the appropriations process, have Congress, Congress actually is the one that legislates how we spend the money. They jumped in there, and they're just, wherever they can make a cut, however they can make a cut, they're doing that. I would like to hear first your guttural reactions that, of course, are informed about what's at stake. Like, we all are coming to this, we're anxious, but from your vantage points, hearing what you're hearing, I'm a lawyer, and when they first started issuing, the Trump administration started issuing all the executive orders, people kept saying, well, they can't do that. They can't do this. Like, they don't have the authority to do that. They didn't care, right? And now we see, even with, the judiciary, which is the third branch of government. This is my son. We can't take the call, though. I'm going to let him know I'm doing something else. I'm supposed to always take that call, right? But not right now. But people kept on saying, well, they're executive orders. They can't do that. Now they're just like, they don't care, even with judges putting in injunctive orders, telling them you can't move. They just keep moving. So you all could go in 1,001 places, but I want you to center perhaps just on one issue. When you think about in this moment, what is at stake with your informed experiences? I'll begin with you, Nathan.
All right, let's see. I think I want to focus on two issues and be sort of bombastic and alarmist, and then very nerdy in sequence. So, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that potentially the rule of law is at stake itself. There were a lot of debates before this administration came into power about whether that was a realistic thing to be concerned about, and is that just something that, right-wing trolls tweet about, or is it really their strategy? It seems to be the strategy. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that there are at least a lot of groups or dimensions of the administration and their supporters that pretty consciously engaged in conspiracy to consolidate a really unprecedented level of executive power. They've previewed that, and now they're testing out that theory. right? Can they just ignore what the judges say? Can they turn ICE into a Gestapo, arrest people, deport them, sort of baselessly? And so that's literally a risk to the constitutional order. Again, a few months ago, that might have been a very alarmist thing to say. Now it is just manifestly what they're trying to pull off. And we'll see where it goes. Okay, that's comment one. Comment two is very nerdy, but they are basically trying to eliminate the income tax, right? And the thing about the income tax is really the history of American social policy is the history of the income tax. The rich pay, I mean, some rich people pay very little tax, but a lot of rich people pay a lot of tax, as they ought to. But everyone pays tax, mostly through the income tax. And that's why we're able to have the really substantial federal expenditure programs that we have, right? All this DOGE stuff is a rounding error in the federal budget. The money is in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And it's been a long-standing right-wing objective to eliminate those programs in order to reduce or eliminate the tax burden, especially on higher earners. So all of this stuff about tariffs and McKinley in the late 19th century, the administration really idealizes a period of American history when there was no income tax, when federal expenditures were very low, and when revenue came from tariffs. So there's a sort of very explicit theme in all of the tariff messaging and the tax messaging that is really a radicalization of what's actually been a consistent policy priority of the right for decades, which is really rolling back the whole architecture of federal fiscal policy.
I'm like, it's like drop the mic, right? Right, like, that's very scary. That's very daunting. And just even beginning with that, this has been the scaffolding that has been building for some time. And so now we are in reactive mode. You know, I can't even say responsive mode. In many ways, we're in reactive mode. From your vantage point, Krista?
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. So I'm coming at it more from sort of what all that pays for and what we receive as a city. And the federal funding landscape is vast. Over $100 billion flows to New York City. There's the $9 billion that Brad and Emily talked about, but there's a lot more. There's the Social Security, Medicaid and Medicare. Over $50 billion comes to our healthcare providers. Even more when you include the state funding, but those federal dollars are critical to the city. Over 60% of New York City residents receive Medicaid or the Essential Plan, so it's huge, and many of them are working. And then there's also funding that goes to other governmental entities like CUNY, NYCHA, that's not included in the city's operating budget. There's funding that goes to capital for infrastructure and transit. So I think it's vast and then really kind of embedded in New York City in many ways. I think the sort of, to bring it back to the human service sector, where all our heads are spinning with all these cuts to this, the way we're thinking about in terms of the city's budget, grants to nonprofits. But that broader landscape is really important, especially when you layer on the economic policies. If there's a downturn, it's this sector that everyone relies on. So you have to pay attention to all of that on top of your specific grants. And it's really important that we figure out how to stabilize so that we're ready.
Lisa?
Is it? Yep. So it's a hard conversation to have without thinking, that the incredible intensity of what's coming at us. But first of all, thank you so much for hosting me and for being here. And I love the introduction. I am old. That is the point.
Not if you're old and I'm old.
Right, one of us looks older. Jennifer started when she was 6. I totally agree with everything Krista and Nathan have said. IBO is an independent agency. We are not politically affiliated with any other elected official. In general, our opinions are held to ourselves, and we are extremely cautious, but we have been talking about the threat of the silent local administration. Because we do not know what our local administration, and by that I mean the mayor, we do not know where they stand publicly, as they are not saying anything. And so this is really challenging, both to understand priorities that they are setting, which they need to do, and also to understand where they are agreeing or disagreeing. So we could give a series of examples like the a challenge to the MTA on their public safety. How does that interact and have fiscal consequences? That was yesterday. Or last week, the demand for information on individuals housed in shelter, and perhaps from an ICE perspective, but also in potential violation of many other local values. So, I think that is a huge issue. And I believe that the power gained by articulating that is holding our elected officials accountable. We want to know what you think. That's why we elected you. The other thing that, from an IBO perspective, and this is sort of nerdier, but not really, is that the incredible decrease in the federal workforce, whether it's effective or not, impacts operations. So there are 49,000 federal employees in New York City. And we have a couple examples that we've been talking about. All of the air traffic controllers are federal employees. If they are let go, you cannot backfill those. Oh boy, that's terrifying. All of the employees at our federal parks, like the Statue of Liberty, are federal employees. Now, if the Statue of Liberty is closed, that may have less immediate danger, but symbolically, that's something. So we're really concerned on the federal employees. There are 6 federal employees at the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene who were fired and then rehired. So that the concern is, well, what are they doing and why were they let go and rehired? This level of operational concern is obviously local and also national. An enormous change in our workforce is going to mean changes in how programs are administered. So even if the programs stay whole or continuing or moving, if the people aren't there that do the critical work, and the critical work is not just pushing buttons, it's understanding policies and interpreting and delivering and serving the country the way us as a nation have indicated we actually prefer. That will also have incredible impact on New York City. So that's optimistic. Okay, Jocelyn, your turn.
And I'll even say, so appreciate what you're saying. We even have a situation where New York City in some way has provided itself some covering for the next little while with respect to our charter revisions centering on justice and equity. And the city, under this mayoral administration, is now 400 plus days late in releasing their plans for making sure that we have equity for everybody in New York City. And I'll be the one to say it's all tied to what's happening down at the federal level and not wanting to even voice the word equity for fear on the part of our mayor of what might happen. I came to you, Dr. Rainey, Jocelyn, last because, what happens is everybody turns to philanthropy when the sky is falling. And it's like, so what y'all gonna do? Right? We need more of you. And I'll just say it. You didn't say it. Let's make clear. Jennifer, this black girl said it. Just that sometimes they confuse us. Forgive me. But philanthropy, the people who have the resources to engage and give a lot of money to philanthropy are the ones who actually will benefit. Not all people, but many, from what is happening right now. So, it's like we want philanthropy to be more engaged in this, but it's a tightrope that you probably have to walk. And so what's at stake in this moment?
So one, when you spoke earlier, I thought when you said, hey, not to sound the alarm, I think right now we need to sound the alarm. Like what's happening right now is, and I use this term all the time, this is domestic terrorism. This is a way of having us look at this shiny thing over here while this shiny thing is going on over there, right? So we're like thinking about like they want to undo income taxes. But they're also, as Jennifer said earlier, they're also thinking about how do we make the minority the majority at the same time, right? And that the folks that are most impacted are the middle class and the poor, and that's very intentional. And when you talk about broken scaffolding, we were already in a state of our country not making sure that people who are poor are getting what they deserve, right? And that poverty is a huge issue that we were already unstable, and now the middle class is unstable. And I think to Jennifer's point earlier, you know, my kids can't afford my house, right? Like they can't afford, and their cost. So this is an all of us issue. But I think that when we think about philanthropy, I try to think about philanthropy very differently about how do we stand in this moment and maintain our missions, whatever those missions are. Our mission is racial justice and Brooklyn, and unapologetically so, and doing the work to make sure that we can continue to do that work, especially today. Also knowing that philanthropy is not going to be able to close every gap, but what we can do is we can be the coalition conveners. We can figure out how to help fund organizations that get the audits that they're going to need to move forward. But I do think that this is a really tricky time, and that, you know, philanthropy is many of the folks that are philanthropic are benefiting from this, or they may actually, you know, feel like, you know, this is okay. So it's like, how do you help them to understand that the movement of their wealth into philanthropy in order to stabilize our communities is something that's going to benefit them as well. So to your point, it's not easy work. For me, I have to say it's easier than most, because the folks that support us and my board believe in this work. But I've been on calls with other folks in philanthropy where they say that, you know, it's really hard when they go into their board meetings to order to get people to move that money. I think that, you know, philanthropy has to think about who they are, say who they are, and help people to understand that taking care of, and this is one of our catchphrases, taking care of your neighbors is actually taking care of yourself and taking care of the city. And if you want a certain kind of quality of life, you want to make sure that folks have what they have. So I think that there's a lot of brokenness that goes way beyond what they're focusing on, that folks are seeing when we think about the safety issue in New York City, the subway issue in New York City, our terrible infrastructure that philanthropy should be, you know, I lean into in order to say, you know, how do you move your funding to help us to support your neighbors so that your kids have a better quality of life. And I think that has to be the center. And like, I consistently stay there so that folks aren't saying, well, you know, they should pull themselves by their footsteps. Or why are we supporting this work? Well, 33% of all nonprofits in America get federal funding. 33%. That's 1/3 of all nonprofits. 40% apply. So this is really important for us to really re-ensure this scaffolding that is already terribly broken.
Add something to that. You know, I think just in terms of scale, it's helpful to think about some basic numbers. There's understandably a tendency to look to philanthropy, and I mean, I'm not a philanthropist, to maybe directly fund things, right? Put money into direct services or gap filling. But nothing has the power to spend like the government does, right? So it's really like, and I mean, I say this as someone who runs a policy organization, but it's a good case for that money like going to support policy work. I think the entire endowment of the Ford Foundation is $40 billion, right? The city budget is $115 billion. The state budget is $250 billion. The federal budget is $7 trillion. So in terms of paying for things, it's the government's power to tax and spend that gets it done. And philanthropy can be helpful. But there's no world in which charities step in to replace the fiscal functions of the state.
Okay, we gotta go up. This is so helpful. So, as some of you know, probably all of you know, because I've probably bent your ear on this, and as many who are gathered with us know, FPWA in, oh goodness, I guess going back to 2017 or so, 2015, 2016, when the state moved to begin raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, we grew very concerned about the benefits cliff, about some people who were making just under 15 now going $1 or $2 up, or those who were at 12 going $2 or $3 up per hour, and that increase in income rendering them ineligible for critical income supports. Maybe they would go up and they'd lose their child care subsidy, their food supports, and what have you, and then they'd wind up in a worse off financial position than when their wages were lower. So we leaned into that, and one of the things that we grew to appreciate was that while that was going to be an issue for some, there were many people throughout New York City and the state who are actually well above that $15 minimum wage. We're still struggling to both make ends meet and actually get ahead. And that's when we began talking about the importance of a different measure for cost of living, and began speaking about the need for a true cost of living. We were fortunate to find ourselves as whisperers and influencers in the Racial Justice Commission, and to get on the ballot a mandate for New York City to annually calculate the true cost of living, to base it in dignity, economic security. The measure passed overwhelmingly by 81% of the New York City electorate. New York City has yet to actually release that measure. They were to do it last year. And the measure is intended to actually look at what it costs for New Yorkers to meet their daily needs, save for retirement, save for their children, whether, occasional, we all have them, like costs, unforeseen costs, they call them economic storms, and keep getting ahead, keep doing better. The measure has yet to come out, but in the meantime, FPWA, in partnership with the Community Services Society of New York, commissioned the Urban Institute to develop a national true cost of economic security that looks at every county across the United States to determine what it costs for people to both, to pay their costs, including debt, housing and more, and savings, and then actually how much resources people have. When we look at New York City, what that measure tells us is that 62% of New Yorkers are economically insecure. Now, if we use poverty numbers or supplemental poverty numbers, it looks like we're in the low double digits. But what we really know is people actually really struggling. A lot of people are struggling. If you go and you look specifically, let's say, at the Bronx, what that economic security measure tells us is that 86% of families with children are economically insecure. 86%, right? Okay, just to make sure I got that right. Do you understand what that looks like in the Bronx? That means that there's only at best 2 children, but not even 1.5 children, or in families where their families are able to take care of them and help them to thrive. Why am I saying all of that? We've got a mayoral election coming up. So we've got these existing challenges. Now we're about to see possibly the erosion of Medicaid, as much as $50 billion here in New York City. Housing subsidies may fall by the wayside. Child care, block grant, SNAP, all of that. If you all were talking, I'm not going to say to the mayoral candidates because there's too many, right? But if you were talking to the person who would be mayor in this moment, balancing the problems we already have, coupled with the problems that are on the horizon or that are here at our doorstep, what are the things that we would be telling them about the people who are most challenged and what their budgets need to be doing in this moment? Ways that they should be thinking about this issue. Throwing away all the cards. Any thoughts on that? I mean, and as you're thinking, I'll tell you, I was in the room with one when the person, someone in the room asked about affordability. This person was appeared to be a upper middle income person and said she feels the city is growing more and more unaffordable. And the response that this mayor hopeful gave was, you feel that way because the city isn't functioning the way that it should be functioning. You just don't feel like you're getting the most out of your dollars. And I was like, do you hear her? She did not say I'm not getting my money's worth. She said, it's too unaffordable. I don't have what it takes to live here. What do we do in this moment?
I just want to say we just finished with other philanthropies and Fibro Institute actually did a poll for us, because one of the things that we think about a lot is how do we understand what's happening to communities. One of the things, and Jennifer and I have talked about this, that I think about a lot is that as nonprofits, we talk a lot about those people that are in the lower socioeconomic brackets, right? But the truth is that those of us who are in the middle and upper middle are also struggling as well, and we need our government to understand that. And just circling back, I think we do know where our administration statements, right? I think they're, that we know where they stand. It's and because of their silence. But but one of the things I want to share with you is that what came out of that poll was that 49% of people from, who responded feel like New York City is so unaffordable that they want to leave. Close to 60% or 61% of people have known someone, or they themselves have dealt with some level of housing insecurity, right? Or not being able to meet everyday needs. So I feel like these cuts are just going to exacerbate things that we're already dealing with. And that if I was talking to a mayoral candidate, one, I would say that housing inventory is not an issue, and that we need to make sure that we are keeping our subsidies around housing, and that we need to expand them. And so these cuts are going to hurt people who are always hurting. Someone just said the other day that if white America gets a cold, we get the flu, right? And so we need to make sure that we're talking out loud about, and whoever this person was, kudos to her. Like, so many of us don't talk about how we're struggling to buy eggs too, right? We're struggling as well, and that these cuts to Medicaid and housing and health and daycare is going to hurt everyone, and that we cannot afford to have a mayor or a congressman or a senator that is not going to stand up to this. We cannot, I can't afford to go out to eat. I don't know how many of you, but I go out to eat. I used to go out to eat 3-4 times a week with my husband. Like, I can't afford that anymore. Every time you step out and go out to eat, it's $100 and something. There's no more $60. I had a cocktail and a pizza with my husband,
No longer
right?
just a dry January.
Yeah.
Dry February, dry March.
And so I would say, Jennifer, I would say that we can't just go to everything. We have to understand they're trying to do everything at once. Like, everything is happening, and that we cannot just focus on the one thing. We have to figure out how to, as a unified group, how to be able to focus on everything that is happening and what the intent is and what that means for our neighbors. And again, it's not charity. It's actually self-preservation, right? Like, so we need to pay attention to that. So I think that that's the one thing that I really focus on quite a bit, is that subsidies for housing, it has to be across the board, and there has to be more. And these cuts are just we're gonna have more poor. We're gonna have more people in poverty.
Nathan?
Well, all right. We do have a lot to say about this at FPI. So we've done a lot of research on migration. Brad and Emily mentioned this earlier, because our primary focus is state fiscal policy, actually. And I think every year, always and for eternity, there's a debate over taxes, and are they too high, and are they making rich people leave? And we found no, they don't do that, but there are a lot of working and middle income families leaving. By far, the most frequently reasons cited for moving by those families are the cost of housing and the cost of childcare. And that's not surprising if you just look at the cost trends in housing and childcare, or if you've ever read the news. The other thing that needs to be thrown into that mix is healthcare. So yes, we've had inflation. Yes, eggs are way too freaking expensive, but just zoom out. What really makes it so expensive to live here? What makes it so that you freak out when the price of eggs rises by $3? It's that housing is too expensive, healthcare is too expensive, and childcare is too expensive. The thing that if there's a silver lining to all of this, it's that it invites some more seminar-style policy thinking that normally is kind of disallowed by the way we have policy debates, where whenever you try to raise an interesting idea, somebody says, yeah, but someone will say this and that, and you get really locked into the existing dynamics and options. But in a moment of crisis like this, you get to think a little bit bigger. And so at that more abstract level, I would say, the state basically has two powers, right? It can tax and spend, and it can regulate. And so there are some cases where the answer is actually to tax and spend more. And you just have to have a view that is, very strongly my view, that says, right, everyone should pay taxes, the rich should pay more, but everyone pays, and that's how we pay for public services. That's why you get an MTA. And some of the things we pay for are sort of redistributive, or they keep people out of poverty. But there are other big spending programs that make sense to pay into, right? So that's sort of the model of Social Security. But we should also think about where that intersects with regulatory powers in a way that I think is often not present in our policy discussions. So if you want to bring down the cost of housing, there are some people who are going to lose out. At FPI, we're pro-rent regulation and pro-supply, and there are a lot of vested interests that are very opposed to both of those things. Right? In the case of healthcare, you got to, at the end of the day, if you're not willing to stick it to health insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, and I'm sorry to say, a lot of providers, you don't bring down the cost of healthcare. So those are very politically challenging moves to make, but that is how you manage the affordability challenge. And everything else is kind of window dressing. So right now we're being very critical of some quote unquote middle class tax cuts proposed in the state budget. It's not going to make a difference to anybody, and it's just going to lead to budget cuts further down the road. But that is much more representative of the kind of typical response to affordability concerns. Hey, maybe we can throw people a little bit of cash. It doesn't really do anything other than create budget problems. You really need a sort of big picture regulatory agenda.
To that point, one of the things that we appreciate when we look at the research findings of the Urban Institute with respect to the true cost of economic security is that in New York State, the gap between what people have to be economically secure, and that's not rich, right? That's just like having enough to be able to literally be able to thrive, to make sure that your bills are paid and you can save, and that in your older days you'll be okay, that your children will be okay. The gap in New York State, $36,000 on average for New Yorkers. So even when you look at the tax proposals, the tax cut proposals that Governor Hochul proposed, that she said in its entirety would result in about $5,000. Well, what's that going to do? It makes people feel maybe good in the moment, but $5,000 if your gap is $36,000 doesn't really do a whole lot, right? Mayor Adams axed the tax. $300. So it sounds good to everybody. It maybe doesn't even buy you a cup of coffee every day. A few eggs. Lucy eggs. Selling Lucy eggs. And again, this is that knowledge, you hear it, you think it sounds good, but if you don't know. I have one quick follow-up question for you, Nathan. One of the things that we're also looking at very closely here at FPWA is wealth. It was at this forum last year that an individual stood up and said, I work with low wealth individuals. And it was like the heavens opened up for me. She was talking about how she works with individuals and families who are in need of services and supports, she didn't refer to them as low income. She referred to them as low wealth. And I will never forget that moment, because it was like, my goodness, I've been at this work for better than 30 years. And I hadn't thought about it before, but like how wealth is really like the defining divider, right? And so, but wealth is associated with deservedness, and you've earned your way. Meanwhile, we know it's wealth that actually keeps people staying afloat. Assets, resources of other types that help you weather economic storms and not just live day to day. So Nathan, my quick question in that long lead up is, we talk about income taxes, but what about wealth and taxes? And is there an opportunity? Is this the moment when maybe we need to, as a nation, as a city, like engage on that front?
So you might not love my answer to this question.
Okay, no, talk to me.
As someone who I guess was, and I would say still am, a tax lawyer, I tend to be more bearish on the benefits of wealth taxes than a lot of our progressive allies.
Okay.
And there are a few reasons for that. One, there's a saying in tax policy that an old tax is a good tax. As I said earlier, it took decades to get the income tax to really work well. Tax and people don't complain about it, right, for this sort of banal but like historically hugely important reason of employer withholding. If instead of having your income tax liability taken out of your paycheck, you had to write the IRS a check for $11,000 at the end of the year, everyone would be super pissed off all the time. So once you have like a working tax architecture, you keep it and you do everything you can with it. There's some real technical challenges in implementing that for a wealth tax. I still think it's a good idea, but in terms of the revenue yield and the fiscal upside, it really doesn't compare to what we can get out of the income tax. And there's a lot more potential to get out of the income tax actually as we have it. So, that's true at the federal level, it's true at the state level. I think it's politically important because of the current state of extreme inequality. But even then, the support you see for a wealth tax tends to be something that would apply to people who are like extraordinarily wealthy. Mm-hmm. And if you have a billionaire wealth tax, it doesn't really translate into something that's so fiscally consequential. If you were willing to sort of apply an across-the-board wealth tax, then that might be different. But I don't know, intuitively, I don't think most people would even be comfortable with that. I think there's sort of the sense that even if you're worth a few tens of millions of dollars, it would be unfair to stick a wealth tax on you. So I think those are some things that make me much less enthusiastic about trying to pursue that, especially on the revenue front. But as a sort of tax fairness measure, I think it's totally reasonable and worth working on.
That's fair. We should keep talking. And maybe it's coming at it the other way. How do you use taxes to help build wealth for people who do not have wealth?
I think that's right. One thing just to say about wealth accumulation is that for most people, to the extent they develop wealth, it's just a function of their ability to save money. And then, maybe you have a 401k or something, but most people have very low investment holdings and low investment earnings. It's really the sort of heirs and the ultra-rich for whom that makes a big difference. You do want people to accumulate wealth just because that's right what stabilizes you when the economy goes bad. And so I think that goes back to the affordability point, right? People need to be earning enough and have low enough living expenses that they can save enough to have wealth, not to ever be rich, but just so that they aren't in such a risky position in case of a downturn or, say, unemployment.
Okay, more to come on that. We're having lunch. We talked about that already. All right. I'm going to jump ahead. In case you want to say something about the mayor and mayoral elections, Krista, you may not want to. I don't know. We can, but as I'm going to turn to the two of you first, Louisa and Krista. You can say something about the mayor, what you'd say the mayor. But I am curious because you both are looking at numbers on a daily. And what are the questions that you all are asking when we think about the human services sector and the challenges that are ever growing. What are the questions that you're asking in this moment to help us gain the knowledge to actually push in the way that we need to push? Is that clear?
Are you saying what are the questions that we're asking to
To
the
you,
numbers?
What are you
or
all
to all of
sitting
you
in your respective
terms of-
spaces?
Yeah,
When you just don't look at the numbers and put them out.
yeah.
You analyze the numbers. You look at what the numbers tell us and what that says about not just fiscal policy, but then, again, like how services are funded, how people are affected. What are the questions that you're asking in this moment to help us gain further knowledge, further insight, so we know what we're talking about when we're pushing back? Said differently, we hear that with the proposed tax, the proposed spending bill that has now come through, that we could see, significant hundreds of billions of dollars in losses to Medicaid. So for the comptroller's office, knowing that $50 billion flows to New York City, how are you thinking about that? What are the questions you're asking? The independent budget office, what are you thinking about the questions that need, what are the questions, the research that need to be done for us to appreciate on the front lines what the impact is and how we need to be ready, how we can engage?
I'll take the Medicaid question, which is particularly complicated because of the way the funding flows. So it actually shows up as an expenditure for the city in the city's budget. We pay a local contribution. And then that contribution and the federal funding comes together in the state's budget and all gets kind of combined, and then it flows to healthcare providers on behalf of their patients. We actually put out an explainer, so if you want kind of the wonky deep dive on Medicaid, you can take a look at that. It was really our knowing that this was going to become increasingly important that we took the time to understand it ourselves and try to explain it, and really look at what some of those risks are. And there are a lot of different ways that we can see that the administration and the Congress may impact that. There's sort of more, there's the Medicaid, there are waivers that they get, there's eligibility, there's the cuts that are in the House reconciliation, the resolution. So we just first are just starting out, to your point earlier, of just gathering knowledge to understand how it works so we can then better see what the possible impacts are. And then I think it will depend a lot on what happens. There's a lot of questions as to whether the House Republicans will really do this to their constituents. Their constituents are at least as dependent on Medicaid. So it's going to be really interesting to see who they are beholden to. And I'm not sure I can predict it.
Do you think they understood that before they went to their town halls, that this was them too?
I do think they know that their constituents depend on it, because that's why there haven't been cuts previously. But the terms of power are different now, and who they're kind of beholden to, and the threat of Elon Musk's millions of dollars going into some other campaign. I think they're, I don't know. Anyway, I think that's the big question, but I think the first question is just how does it work, and who does it impact, and then really paying attention so we can be prepared. How the state will react to those cuts is another big question and unknown.
And there are a whole lot of politics there as well.
And a whole lot of politics there as well.
I feel like we're in this space where we're all in the car, and none of us are driving. And we all want to be backseat drivers. We all but it's a problem. It's a real problem. Louisa?
It is a problem. Okay, so IBO is paying attention to the nuances of every single funding stream so as to understand exactly as changes occur or are potentially occurring, where might they cascade through. I'm going to say a little bit more on what Krista said. So the state, 38% of the state's budget is federally funded. If those funds are stopped or reduced, the state will need to make choices. And the power you all have is to stand up and say, we are a priority. IBO is not suggesting that you say that. We're just saying that's your power. So the example, we've been trying to explain to people that, that any government has money that they can move around, i.e. their own tax levy, and then money where you can't move it around because it's from someone else with rules as to what you can use it for. So the state will need to make choices with its own tax money, its movable money, as to what it chooses to backfill or not. And it cannot backfill everything. It does not have enough extra money to backfill everything that might be turned off or eliminated, and there's a difference. So that is a quite challenging circumstance. We pay a great deal of attention every day. We talk to the controller's office, looked in the morning at the bank account and said, wait, why is the city bank account in deficit? And where is that money? And we all know that if we deposit a check, the bank's not meant to give that check back to whoever wrote it to us if it was valid. But that is what the federal government did for the $80 million for a competitive process where the city submitted its invoice and was reasonably paid, and the feds then clawed that back. IBO, just as a matter of interest, looked at, well, what is this program? And it was a FEMA program, and Texas got like 40 million more than New York State, just telling you all. So that's also a question, is who else is getting these monies, and who gets, where does New York stand in the overall equation? The other thing the IBO does is when programs change, we try and understand what is the city's reaction. And so that comes back to silence, but also back to city changing policies and shifting how they're doing things, not in the actual budget, but just in general. So I'm going to use really quickly the example of cash assistance and SNAP cases that are way up, and the city processing time is down. So people eligible are taking longer to get their benefits, but the overall amount of population is higher. And perhaps the population grew, certainly the population grew during the COVID era because of the pressures on individuals during the COVID era. But there is also a question as to whether or not the city was falsely suppressing the number of people eligible for these benefits by having numerous burdensome processes in the application process. You have to present yourself in person, you have to do it every month, you have to, you can't call in, you have to present, you have to be in person someplace when you should be at work. There were all these processes that got people, one could hypothesize, to drop off the rolls. And in fact, it is possible that what we're seeing now in terms of usage is actually accurate and should have been this way 10 years ago too, except that the city's processes were keeping people off. So I went out and talked to the HRA commissioner saying, is it possible? And she was like, no, it's going to change. I'm like, based on what? Based on, what is your data to indicate this? So I think the point in this is the more we all have data, the more we understand what's going on. How's Texas doing? Is data, in this program compared to us? How many people are getting this benefit now versus 10 years ago? Are there changes in rules? That's data. And who's making big picture choices as to what the priorities are data. But it feels like this is an era where there's less and less attention to facts and more need to actually, central to the powers to gain the facts. So, we're really excited because we're going to soon have a new website. I have been frantically trying to get data out of our current website as I sit up here. But facts count. And that is a huge part of the power of understanding how our city currently operates, will operate, how our state operates, and also how other jurisdictions are doing. So we encourage people to learn more.
You said facts count, and I couldn't help but think to myself, in this particular moment, at this particular time, facts are actually validating feeling. You know what I mean? Facts are not, they're not removed. They're not, you know, like it's not somebody else. It's like facts in this moment are validating what people are feeling, and we have to figure out how to continually communicate such so people know you're not in this alone. Like, this is an everybody issue. We're going to take questions. Before we do that, though, I'd like each of the panelists to help us, you know, appreciate what this moment of crisis does present by way of opportunity, you know, and how, and or how we each, you just gave us some advice about like some of the things that we can be doing, but like how we all can engage in this space. I have become, and the team here at FPWA is probably like, oh my God, here she goes again. It's like I think about something like, oh my goodness, we need to write about this. I need to start writing. We're gonna write. And it's like, okay, here she goes. Like, you know, like Nina Rogers, who's our communications director, is like juggling, like, okay, when's this opinion piece going and where is it going? But recently I wrote a piece, and I can't remember what it was titled. It was 3-card Monty, or like don't be fooled by the 3-card Monty, or whatever. And essentially what I was saying, and you know, and I knew that it might get some pushback, was that we're in this moment where everybody who is in the civil rights space in leadership seems to be focusing on DEI. Everything's about boycott this company and resist that company and push back on the DEI. It's a real issue. But doing so, everybody's over here, 3-card Monty, let me give that up, because not all of you necessarily grew up in New York City. 3-card Monty, Jocelyn, I don't know if you ever were down on Delancey Street, right? Anybody remember the 3-card Monty? 42nd Street, right? You got the 3 cards. Everybody knows this? Sometimes I think it's played in the cabs, if you're in the cabs, right? And it's like the 3 cards, and they say, which one's your card? And you say, oh, I got the 7 of diamonds. All right, here's your card. And then they start moving it around on the cardboard box, and you're trying to keep following your card, and there's a pile of cash that's waiting for you. Just to like remember your card, like 30 seconds later. And if you pull up that 7 diamonds when they flip them over, if you say, it's that one, and it's that one, you get the pile of cash. If not, you lost your 20 or 30, whatever you put down. This is what's happening in my mind right now with DEI. So everybody, you got all these civil rights leaders pushing back. They're trying to get rid of DEI. Meanwhile, they're cutting federal funding for the most vulnerable, people made vulnerable. They're cutting the federal jobs, right? They're doing what you helped us to appreciate about the personal income tax. But you've got all these stalwart institutions telling us to look over here at corporate America, while the Elon Musks, in my opinion, and his puppet, you know, the president, are doing all of these other things that are actually impacting the masses. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this moment is help people the best I can. And that piece that we did was published in the Amsterdam News intentionally to help Black Americans appreciate. Yeah, we gotta be worried about DEI, but there are many people who never even would get to the table or be considered because of the persisting inequity that exists in America for people who've been marginalized. They're the ones who are losing their benefits. They're the ones who stand to lose their benefits and their jobs. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. I don't know if that's positive, but it's one of the ways I'm trying to figure out. As we fight, you know, as I go up to Albany, you know, as we press the city, as we push for the establishment of this true cost of economic security, so we have a different measure that people see themselves in, and then maybe they, not just people who are classified as poor, but people who are middle income, say, wait a minute, that's me too. You need to do better by me. That's the work that we're trying to do. What are some of the things that people can be doing in this moment to be more like me? And even if it's just on how to be a more caring community. You know, Jocelyn and I were talking about, and maybe you want to tell them one of the things that we were thinking about, maybe for if this tax cut goes through.
Well, Jennifer had this.
Us.
It was Jennifer's idea, which I thought was amazing, is that you know, when we think about philanthropy, and I want to leave you guys with a couple of things that I want you to, I always feel when I leave with like some actionable things. And when I think about nonprofits, the work that you guys are doing is going to be so important. And I so appreciate the comment about, you know what, you have to say, like, make me a priority. And what I will say to all of you is that I feel like where I can be supportive and where philanthropy can be supportive is that we can stand in the gap for you and say why you're important. And that's what I feel is a huge part of my responsibility as someone who doesn't get any government funding, right? We don't get government funding, you do. And so I feel like a lot of our work is around how do we create platforms where we can lift up the work that you do for communities. So I wanted to say that. Two is I think that the other thing that we've been working from thinking about a model of philanthropy that's different is that everyone can be philanthropic. You know, when someone here said, I'm not a philanthropist, and I said, well, I think I'm a philanthropist, right? I'm not a high wealth individual, but I am a philanthropist, and I make sure that I'm investing back into work that is making my community stronger. And so it's really important for us to start thinking about, you know what, how folks could be philanthropists. And Jennifer came, we were talking around these issues and what's needed. And what Jennifer said is that if we are benefiting from tax cuts, right, like then do we take those tax cuts and then invest them back into the work of the nonprofits that are helping our communities thrive and helping folks to be safe and ultimately keeping us all safe. And I think that's a campaign that I hope that we get to that point of making that happen. And the other piece is really thinking about, when we think about this, like boycotting an organization, boycotting folks, like some people can only afford to shop at those places. We need to start thinking about mutual aid. And I'm gonna use this as my last time to speak, so I'm gonna give a couple of other things that I want people to think of. When we think about mutual aid, like how do we make sure that the folks that Michelle Price takes care of, the folks that go so where I was before, how do we make sure that those young people are stable while they're getting the services they need in order to then enter the labor market, right? So we need to think about all those things, and you as nonprofits need to start having those conversations in that way. Like everyone can support you, like everyone can be philanthropic in some way, and we should be thinking really strategically about like these tax cuts. One of my very wealthy board members asked us where should she get her Trump bump. She called it her Trump bump, and she gave everything that she got back out to nonprofits. So, but we could do that at every level, and we need to do that even more now because we're in jeopardy. And also, I think that as nonprofits, what I was thinking about when we were talking about this during this crisis, need to look at our budgets and look at them really critically and look at, like, you know, where you can make, what's important to you and what you should and shouldn't be doing, where you want to focus, and that you should also be thinking about how do you diversify your funding, right? Like it's important to understand like what's happening. It's also important to understand how you can diversify funding. A lot of folks that were focused on federal funding have not been able to focus on other funding. Like you just don't have the time or the bandwidth, right? You're like, I get, 90% of my funding comes from federal funding. I have a few high wealth people, I'm good. Now you need to start looking at that now about how you can now diversify your funding, how you can get more philanthropic funding, foundation funding, even though to Nathan's point, we're never going to be able to close that gap. But some of you who are getting a lot of federal funding, state funding, city funding, you're not able to focus on other funding. So it's time to start focusing on other funding as well. And we offer capacity building workshops, all those things on all these things around, helping you to create an LOI template, connecting you to other funders. So please visit our website because we're thinking about how do we cast a wider net by engaging with more nonprofits. Even if we can't fund you, what we want to do is support the work that you're doing because the work that you're doing is actually helping communities to thrive. So thank you. I
will, talk about a couple things. to your question a little bit about opportunity and kind of what our roles can be. So, one, I think, it's cliche, but it is obviously a time to come together and work together. To that point, next week, we are hosting with the United Way and the Human Services Council a roundtable for nonprofits. If you haven't, you're all welcome, and if you weren't invited, it was an accident, and so please, you're all invited, join, let me know after this. And I think there we're really trying to bring voices together, understand how we can, as the Controller's Office, be a connector, lift up, provide information to help you with your boards, with your funders, understand what the risks are. So that's one thing, and then I think we just have to look at ourselves in our toolbox of like what we bring. So I'm a budget geek, so I'm spending my time understanding federal funding, but everybody has their talent. So bring that. Oh, actually, and one other thing, kind of to your question about the mayoral candidates, but just so the city really. The city is constrained a little bit in some of these broader questions where the state really dictates tax policy and other things. So I think looking at operations and processes is more important than we give it credit to. And some of what Louisa was talking about in terms of SNAP and eligibility, like it gets really weedy fast, but there's a lot of opportunity, I think, and as many of you are experiencing with payment issues that you're having, there's a lot of opportunity to make city government run better. And I think, especially now, that becomes more important. So,
I would say we can plan. There's a lot of policy planning to do. Like I said before, it's kind of high concept, but in a way it's very realistic now. We're very engaged in the state budget, and the state's kind of consensus view right now between the legislature and the governor is, oh my God, it's so much money, nothing we can do. Why even think about it? Let's just get this budget done, pretend that nothing is happening, and then if it all goes to hell, we'll come back and try to figure it out. I was testifying in the joint legislative hearing on taxes a few weeks ago, and one of the assembly members said, like, why are we even talking about this? It's so much money, right? Impossible to even think about. And so the first thing to say is that's actually not true. It's a lot of money, but it's not an unthinkable amount of money. And the numbers, in a way, are pretty graspable. The state budget for this upcoming year will be $250 to $260 billion, depending on where they come out. About $90 billion of that is federal funding. Of the $90 billion, about $70 billion is Medicaid, because it's just a huge program. The federal cuts that are proposed are $2 trillion, but we always joke that the highest value single fact to know about the federal budget is that all the numbers use a 10-year forecasting window. So if you just divide by 10, you know what the annual cost is, and then everybody else thinks you're some kind of budget genius. So, right, that's $200 billion a year out of a $7 trillion federal budget spread over 50 states. So that's a lot of money for New York. New York, right, takes up a solid share of federal funding. But in terms of what the loss is, that maybe puts you in the $10 to $20 billion ballpark range. And this value of the whole state economy on an annual basis is about $1.5 to $2 trillion. And so that should lead very directly to a tax policy discussion about broad-based revenue-raising measures, stuff that people won't like, but I've written it up and it's used widely in other countries. You could expand the sales tax to cover services at a low rate. Most businesses, we have a corporate tax, but most businesses aren't corporations. They don't pay the corporate tax. You could have a broad-based tax on business profits. You could raise the income tax. And so, there is real contingency planning to be done where you could say, here's the range of funding losses, here's how much we could backfill on a kind of aggressive agenda, and you could whittle down the amount, the sort of strict loss to something that is bad but not catastrophic. Now, there's an understandable political reason why people don't want to do that, which is they want to say, especially to the Republican congressional representatives, this is a catastrophe. Your constituents will hate you forever if you let these cuts go through. Okay, but at the same time, they could at least secretly be saying, what can we actually do about it? And I've seen zero indications that that's happening. So there could be a serious discussion about those sorts of approaches. And then it really has to be paired with other kinds of social policy considerations. Like we've been very actively engaged in thinking about the unemployment insurance system. Right? And this is funded through state taxes. There's another tax. It's always been underfunded. There's a very low amount of revenue that goes into that system. UI is an extremely important economic stabilizer. So there's like very real policy thinking to be done. And you know, if you do it and people take it seriously, you can then organize around that and it sort of filters out. And then down to the level where people say to their electeds, like, hey, what are you doing? And when the electeds come back and say, oh my God, it's a total catastrophe, it's impossible, there's nothing we can do, there's a very clear answer, right? I don't know, I'm talking to my friends at the policy organizations, it looks like your other legislators have put out plans. There's like a path to saying, here's how we manage the crisis. And if you don't do that, then it sort of ends up, frankly, letting everyone off the hook, where bad things happen and they say, well, there was never anything we could have done. And for months, everybody had only been saying there was nothing to do. And it's very hard to push back. But there is actually a path to thinking seriously about responses.
I'm sitting here, I want to hear from you, Lisa, but I can't help but think to myself, I don't know, like, I'm a child who grew up in the church, and I'm not always like preachy or whatever, or biblical, but like the negative connotation with taxes, like it's biblical, right? It goes back to, and so it's like, how do you even talk about these issues, talk about taxes, and get people to see like the value in them? And
Yeah, can you hear me? This is my religion. So it's, you know, to go back actually to your question about the wealth tax, a major theme of tax policy work in recent decades has been tax fairness, which is great, right? We want tax fairness. It's actually not the most important thing, right? The most important thing is revenue, because everyone wants to spend money, and most of us, it turns out, really like the things that the government spends money on. And this is a stronger and better articulated norm in a lot of other countries that have more social democratic policy measures, where people sort of know the taxes they pay and they get better stuff for what they pay, but there's just a strong norm that says, yeah, everybody pays taxes, the rich pay more, and that's how we get public services. And it's basically been a success of the anti-tax movement over the last few decades to attack that norm in every way possible, by cutting tax rates, by sabotaging the IRS, by making everything as hard as possible, even just filing your taxes, so that there is no norm that is pro-tax. But realistically, it's not, like, to the American mind, that's inconceivable. But many countries have much stronger pro-tax norms because there's just a recognition of the relationship between taxes and revenue and public services. So there's no reason we can't get there. You know, it takes some organizing, it takes some policy measures, but I personally think that's the only way that you sort of fix this big set of issues. Because as long as the Republicans and the Democrats respond to every issue by saying, well, perhaps we just do a tax cut, it totally undermines their ability to make any serious progress or even maintain the social policy initiatives that we have in place already.
Having had the privilege to travel through Northern Europe, I'm aware of road quality and, you know, and also, frankly, the difference between the very wealthy and the lowest income levels is simply much less. I spent a year of my life trying to work with low-income individuals in Germany, and they simply did not have poverty the way New York City does. The lowest income individuals were refugees from, at that point, the former Yugoslavia, who still had the societal expectation was totally different as to what individuals should live with. And you know, here we live in a city where you may have stepped over a homeless person on your way here, and that says something about all of us, that's become normalized. I wasn't going to say anything heavy like that. I was going to say we're super nerdy. We're really focused on operations. The first thing I was going to say is the city has a rainy day fund. savings account, if you will, a revenue stabilization fund. And IBO strongly suggests that the rainy day is coming, and it would be a great idea for the city to put, has to have a balanced budget, so if more comes in than gets spent, the extra goes somewhere. There is a constant game between the administration and the city council as to how much extra is that. And so IBO strongly suggests, one, put money into the rainy day fund, and two, city council hold the administration accountable for how much money is really there, because budget experts believe that there is money in other parts of the budget, over budgeted, if you will. Like, they know they're going to spend $10 on this, but they put $100 in that bucket, so that's a $90 secret savings account that they can use later for something, which makes sense during the course of the year, maybe. But maybe also that $90 should be put into a place where the council has, as its due right, oversight and or into the rainy day fund. Which ties to the how complicated is all this stuff. So I was thinking, Jennifer knows the Bible backwards. And that's really complicated. I know because I don't. Budget and government operations is not super complicated. If you can divide by 10, you can get through a lot of things, or 4 is another number that we like to divide by. But I think people paying attention, waking up, tuning in, and figuring out what facts they can gather make a huge difference. So, learn. And the last thing I wanted to say was, this is, anyone who asks me about mayoral candidates, I'm like, well, we got a lot of them. So I think that running New York City, successful operators of New York City don't just have policy vision, but also understand operations. They understand the nuances of the small agencies. They understand the importance of the various parts of our city government. So one great question in a mayoral debate is, what are you going to do about the MTA? Because if your candidate tells you the MTA is not their responsibility, another way to say it is, a lot of the complexity of how nonprofits get paid is an operational failure. And so we, IBO is committed to strong operations. And so we believe that, strong leadership is going to be individuals who understand the details and who don't necessarily need to do them themselves, but need to have a team that can do that. And that is a really important call to the next round of leadership, particularly as there is going to be, this incredible movement within other parts of funding streams that are critical to how the city operates.
All so well said. We're going to take questions if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Before we get there, I'm just going to add that we have a mayoral election, we have a primary coming up. And if ever there was a moment to not do simplistic identity voting, this is that moment. And what I mean by that is that we have become a society where we don't delve deeply into what people are saying. We don't unpack the vision, even if they have one. We voted for somebody who let us know he didn't have a vision. And here we are. This is not the moment to just be going along with somebody just because they have some even racial or ethnic or gender traits that align with yours. This is not that moment. The moment now is to ask critical questions, to lean into what people are saying, to unpack it, and think about not just how it benefits you or possibly would benefit you, but how it benefits your greater community, including those who are all here in this moment being most concerned about. I implore you, that's your most powerful tool right now.
Is this working? Also, understand ranked choice. So make a really smart choice, and just because there are multiple doesn't mean you need to take them all.
My very wise daughter, in 2020, and I won't say anything, 2021, I was doing this, like we're on Zoom, it was COVID, and there was this, like we were talking about ranked choice voting, it was for WABC, and two of the panelists who were on with me, it was a panel, kept saying you have to vote for 8 people. And I kept saying, no, you don't. And they were saying, if you don't vote for 8 people, your vote doesn't count. That's not true. It is not true. It is just like any other election. If you think only one person is worthy of the position, then you put that one person down. And if it happens that your person doesn't win, it's like in any other primary or election. Your person just doesn't win. Putting many people down just gives you an opportunity to keep playing. Like, that's a very simple way of saying, it just gives you an opportunity to stay in the game. But what happens when you're doing that, if you don't think that second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, or eighth person is as qualified as, you're now giving a vote to somebody you don't really think is qualified to do the job. And you're ultimately helping that person become mayor. Think about it this way, and the person shall go nameless. Why did it take us to get through 8 rounds of the primary to get to the mayor we have? Because the great majority of people who were voting didn't think that that person was a first, second, or third, or fourth candidate. So you actually, when you engage in that process, you're actually putting in office or helping to put in office somebody who possibly should not be in that position. You do not have to vote. You don't have to fill in every slot for your vote to count. It's just simply like if you voted for one person and your vote didn't, and that person didn't win, that person just didn't win. That's the fallacy of thought, the way that it's been sold to New Yorkers. If you don't fill out every slot, but you may very well likely be putting in people who you actually do not think should be the mayor of the city of New York. Fair? My 24-year-old daughter said to me when I got off that Zoom and I was like just beside myself, she was in the house, and I said to her, I said, you do understand, you do not have to vote 8 candidate slots. She was like, oh Mom, don't worry about that. I figured that out a long time ago. Because if I'm voting for 8 people, at some point I'm going to be compelled to vote for a certain person, and that person is not getting my vote. And that person who is not getting her vote shall go nameless. Good deal? Keep that in mind. And tell your friends. Do not, if you do not think the person is qualified, if that person does sit in your first top 2 or 3, think 3 and 4 and 5, 6, 7, and 8 times. Although I think this time they cut it off to 4. I think it's 4 people now that you get. I don't know. Fair? Your vote is everything. Any questions? You've said a lot. Debbie?
Thank you so much. My name is Debbie Priya Charity. I'm the economist with Community Service Society of New York, and I'm a very proud chair of the FBI board today for Nathan, who was so brilliant on a brilliant panel. We are in budget season now, just before allergy season in my head. And what I want to say is to all of you, we are long past the time to be delicate. What I want to say is that the city and the state budgets currently presented do not seem to be recognizing the trifecta of threats that we are encountering. The tariffs, the unnecessary, absolutely useless tariffs, are going to wipe off over $1,200 from the average paycheck. For the lower income households, they are going to wipe off $2,000, more than $2,000 in purchasing power. Combine that with the regressive tax cuts, okay? We all know that those tax cuts are designed to grossly benefit the top 1%. So effectively, your effective income post-tax, which is post-tax income inequality is supposed to decrease. But with the extension of these tax cuts, it's going to increase, okay? Third, the spending cuts, whether through programs or through the cutting of the federal workforce, it's going to harm us, okay? Now my question is, and this is what all of you at the end beautifully suggested, what to do, but we really have to call our legislators, talk to them, put pressure on them to do some of the things that Nathan was laying out, that Krista was laying out, that Louisa was laying out. Find money in the budget. What are you going to do when 30,000 housing vouchers are not available? Show us. Go deep, line by line, do the hard work, find the money in these budgets. It's not an insurmountable amount, like we know. 1.5 billion is going to disappear from SNAP for New York State. You have to find the money somewhere. Show us what you are doing. What are you going to do? Axe the tax? Very good. But it's going to have a fleeting impact. Universal school meals are on the line, and 10% cut in TANFs, like we learned. So this is a panel that answered most of our questions. This is a request to all of you. And I'm trying to be as emphatic as possible because this is our only chance. The consequences, if these cuts go through, are going to be devastating for a very, very long time. That is the point.
So well said, Libby.
Is there any work being done to quantify the costs that go beyond the cut in funding? So there's a cut in funding, but then the consequences in people's lives then cost state and local governments and localities money to address the secondary consequences of people not having emergency services or whatever, more homeless people on the street, whatever. However, so you can't just sort of do that writ large, but in particular sectors with Medicaid, for example, or, is there any work being done about that? I mean, certainly at the federal level, that's important because it increases the financial hit to local governments that one could be advocating on the basis of with legislators from across the country. You're not only just losing this funding stream, you're also going to have to pay for blah, blah, blah.
So I think you mentioned some of that, Krista, you spoke to that, but additionally I'd say that it's not just the homeless person, people who are unhoused. It is the everyday New Yorker, building on some of what Debbie was saying, like, this is that moment where I believe you have to show the impact, not just, I'm just gonna say this, not just to the people who much of America have determined are not them, and they don't have to be concerned about them. You have to show them that. Said differently, a lot of people are like, this is not about me. If people lose their Medicaid and I'm not on Medicaid, this is not about me. If people lose food supports, this is not about me. You have to show the impact of those who will directly be impacted, but then how that harm then actually, it flows to others as well. Is there work being done?
Our next kind of project is we're going to be looking at the economic impacts. So which isn't quite the cuts, but may end up including some impact of the cuts. Again, we are kind of waiting to see what happens in Congress in terms of that, like all or nothing for Medicaid. I feel like.
I'm going to challenge you, Krista,
yeah.
real quickly, because you said we're going to wait and see.
Well, we're not waiting, but whether we can say definitively that the Medicaid cuts. I mean, there's just so much riding on that bill. It's yes, it's over 10 years, but it's $880 billion. So 88.
Still a lot.
88. Yeah, it's still a lot. So we can surmise and we can think about it, but it's a big difference depending on what happens there. There are like multipliers of sort of what the impact is of a cut. They're not great, so we're looking at that. I think, and I really encourage, I would do want to hear from all of you in terms of other federal grants that come to you. I think there's a lot, it's hard to track all the federal funding that's going outside of the city, outside of the state. It's a lot of smaller grants, and we have some sources, but I think we're first just starting to quantify where it all goes and what it all does. And then to your point, I think is the next round of if that goes away, that's just like the seed, and then there's this circle around it of the impact. So not yet, but I think, it's all up here.
It's going to matter when the next stage happens, which someone was alluding to earlier, which is after the feds do whatever the feds do, the state has to figure out what it's going to do. And most of the people here and our colleagues in this city and statewide will be advocating for what, gap fill should be prioritized, what perk should be eliminated in order to fill a hole in core, like Medicaid, for example, et cetera. And that advocacy is going to be, the decisions at the state level are going to have to be some kind of complicated balance between which gap fill measures will actually save some cost, and so they're smart fiscally, and which are most important for other reasons about human being.
And it's interesting to say that I just keep thinking that's part of what the tracker is about. It's looking at how the money is flowing and what shall be the impact. And when we know that if you just take, and appreciate that ACS, HRA, and what are the two other agencies that are impacted most? DSS, right? Like, you can see like what that could actually result in and what that would look like for people who directly receive those services. And then you've got to do that. How does that get coupled with now who may also be impacted? I would want, at one point I would say indirectly, but actually are going to be also feeling the effects of it. So that's a place and space to lean into. And I guess I would just posit that, and this goes to your point, Nathan, we have to figure out how to get ahead of these things. That can't be once it happens, right? Because the way that those who are on an opposing side, they plan it out and plot it out for generations, right? And then we're reacting and responding.
And I think there are two sides. So we have this conversation all day, every day. I think there is the granular fiscal understanding of exactly which funding stream is going to which state agency how, and then cascading through to which counties and how, or directly from the feds to the city. So that sort of really understanding the landscape is one side, and what's changing in the landscape, like illuminating that, can only really happen when the change happens. But simultaneously thinking, well, what else could this be? Or, what's a different plan? They're two different things. They're not sequential. And I think that I think the challenge is to scenario play too much right now with, if all of this goes away or if some of that goes away, can be so overwhelming. First of all, to put it together is really complicated. I'm not saying that isn't a reason to do it. I'm just saying the end result could be so terrifying that in some ways you just want to be ready so that as things start actually legally happening, the public authorities can say, okay, this lever is changing in this way. Here are the consequences, public.
I'm also going to just add, we started with sort of, this is much of what they're doing right now, not if they pass cuts in Congress, but what is happening right now is illegal. And I think, some of this is, we shouldn't believe it. Like, they're trying to fool us into believing that these cuts are legitimate. And, obviously that's where I spend a lot of my time and I'm working on it, but in a broader way, we need to keep just through the courts, and then, if they defy the courts, I don't know what the next step is, but I think we also need to take a pause and not give credence to everything that they're doing.
I agree with you.
I would just
That's the
add-
other.
I would just add something.
Let me just quickly say, I agree with you, but
Yeah, and obviously
There are
we're spending a
those
lot
who-
of time doing the
there are
but.
those who are, but no, I'm just saying this because you've got the people who are saying, well, Senator Schumer, you just allowed a bill to get through that can prove devastating, and so they didn't have the authority. They pushed it, and they got what they wanted. So that's the challenge we have.
That's a whole different panel.
Yeah. Can I just add to the original question? I think it's very hard to actually do that estimate, but it's helpful just to look at the different levels at which things are happening, right? So there's money that flows through the state budget where there's a lot of federal money. There's money that flows through the city budget where there's some but actually less federal money. There's federal money that flows directly to New Yorkers. And so you could sort of aggregate it all, but that actually, frankly, could become really unmanageable. I mean, you look at SNAP benefits, right? Medicare, Social Security. So there's like $100 billion of federal money flowing into New York City, but most of that is like federal payments that go directly to New Yorkers. So like you couldn't expect the city government to try to make that up. So there are reaches here where it becomes untenable fiscally, but I still think that that's an invitation to think a little more laterally about what you do, right? So you sort of combine the risks and you say, well, there's some recession risk, there's a risk of losing direct federal payments, there are budgetary risks, and so how do you respond to that? Well, okay, it's some combination of gap filling, but also what's the underlying issue, right? The underlying issue might just be that people who had some income are losing income, and so maybe you look to labor policies and think about wage policy or labor enforcement, or even something like paid leave, because if somebody's parents have lost Social Security, how do you make it so that people can take care of their family members? I think that there's no way to do sort of one-to-one policy projections where you say, if they cut X, we will respond with Y, but you can sort of broadly see this constellation of risks to the economy and then think about what that means in terms of like the fundamentals of the city and state economy. If we still have, it's one thing if it's a recession, another thing if it's not, or if it's a deep recession versus a shallow recession. And so that just gives you opportunities to like respond, but again, you have to sort of be pretty lateral, I think. And
I agree with that, but again, you go to like if you take the work of the tracker is giving you a sense of how the government has been responding over the years. So you also, predictive analyses, right? Based on what has been the policy or the approach, actually helps you to then think about if we do lose X billion dollars and we've got money in the reserves, what is government's thinking about how they're going to utilize whatever money they draw down from the reserves? So if they're losing money and they think they need to put it in one place over another, because that's gonna, the voters are gonna be happy with that or less concerned, I just think that type of analysis also plays a role, and that's like the tracker brings you that perspective.
So I think the tracker is critical. I think we also have to remember that the tracker covers the years of the COVID disaster and that the city got through COVID because the federal government gave us an enormous amount of money. No, I know, but I'm saying that if you look at the tracker, not everything goes down during COVID because of federal money. And I also wanted to say that, Nathan, your talk is the kind of talk that one might expect from elected officials. Like, here's a plan. I got a plan.
you would hope, not to.
I'm just saying,
Toot my
separating
horn.
politics from policy, just in general.
We have a question here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Digna Lane, and I work for Good Shepherd Services. I'm trying to figure out, as I look around the room, we're having these conversations, but part of the group of people I work with are in East New York, Brownsville, and those areas who are considered to be impoverished, right? And I want to know, how do I get this information out to them? I just realized I've been spreading false information about ranked choice voting. And everything I pulled up said differently. So I'm wondering, is there some way I can get that information and re-deliver it back to the community? And also, in addition to that, you just talk about the COVID relief funds and things that were used for programs during COVID. The federal dollars, the stimulus that was assigned to our programs, a lot of our programs have cut because those dollars are no longer there and elected officials no longer deem it as important. In addition to the fact that when we talk about election and we talk about, when we speak about elected officials or people who are running in this horse race, right? People tend to vote for who they know and who they see in their communities, right? So I'm trying to figure out a way, or if there's somewhere I could pull information to kind of re-educate the population that I serve.
We used to do some work on civic engagement, and we need to maybe reactivate that muscle, or at least think about the different community organizations. The organizations like Do Something, the Generation On is another. They may work mainly with younger persons, but then there's also Community Voices Heard. These organizations do a lot around civic engagement, especially around voting time. So we'll talk one-on-one about that, but just also make sure that's resourced. Right. Well, look, there's a lot that I say that later on I'm like, ooh, I didn't know, but now I know better. When you know better, right? So teamwork, we'll figure it out. You have a question?
Hi, I'm America. I actually want to take my current hat off working at a nonprofit and put my original hat on, which is an advocate. And as I've heard all of you speak, and Luisa, you mentioned about how, and Nathan also, how things are so different in Europe. I'm originally from Spain. There is a great sense that we're all interrelated, right? So it's not just I make a little bit more money so I pay more taxes. It's that those taxes make my streets really smooth. So my car doesn't get ruined, that I worked so hard to pay for. And it is so that my parks are beautiful and my water is clean. And as we're talking here, and I've, in my many years working as an advocate, I've sometimes lost my voice talking about the morality of why you should care that we deserve to live in affordable housing, that we deserve quality education, that we deserve to be able to afford to go to the doctor and take our children to the doctor. Like, many people are just disconnected from that because I'm not on Medicaid. It doesn't affect me. But we're talking about these very big millionaires, billionaires who are so excited about these tax cuts. But you know what? They drink the same water we do. They breathe the same air we do. They also want to drive their very expensive cars on roads that won't break their tires, and nobody's talking about that, right? The only way to get, in my experience as an advocate, to get people involved in an issue is when it affects them. So, except for some unnamed individuals, I want to believe that a lot of these billionaires aren't evil. They just don't know. They don't understand. But if I say, hey, you know what? Those taxes that you're paying are making your neighborhood absolutely beautiful and your water clean and your house less likely to get burned by wildfire or a flood if the rains come, maybe they're more willing to pay a little bit more into that tax because they see their direct benefit. And by the way, the reason you should care about good schooling for all of us at every economic level is because in there could be the next student, your next superstar employer 20 years from now. That's gonna make you even more rich and even like better competitor to somebody else. I don't know, if maybe we can start talking about not the we deserve better, our members deserve better. We're human, we already deserve it. Deserving is a judgment word. I don't like that word. But if we say, hey, it's beneficial to you, for all of us to do better, for us buying your product, for us fixing your streets, for us making sure there are air traffic controllers when you take off on your private airplane. You know, you need those engineers making your computers. You need those pilots knowing how to fly in the air through turbulence. Invest in us to make it better for you.
Is this on? I think that the problem with nonprofits, and it's funny, Jennifer and I were talking about this morning, is that we approach this work from charity, right? We think that people automatically know that people deserve stuff, but you know what? They don't. They don't know it. They think that, you know, they're in their own lives, and like you said, I don't think that they're horrible people, and I think that you, America, just kind of framed the way I think about this work every single day. Like, how much better would my life be if I got on the train this morning and no one was laying across three seats because they were exhausted and they had no place else to sleep? How much better would I be in my community in Bedford-Stuyvesant if I didn't see people with their pants hanging down because they were struggling with mental health issues, right? So I think that one of the things is that we don't approach this work from, like, it's beneficial to you as well. And early in my career, before I even started doing this work, when I was more focused on human resources, I would say that, you know what, you're missing out on talent. If we're not investing in people, we're missing out on talent, to your point about that this person could make you richer. So I think that, you know, that approach is really important for nonprofits, because we automatically think that people know that people deserve this. So we're like, oh, help us, you know, in my previous role, you know, help to support people who are formerly incarcerated, right? Instead of explaining why it's important to help that person who's formerly incarcerated, how they're going to be impacted, how much better it's going to make your life and your children's lives, that we don't approach it from that way. And that could be the difference between a $10,000 donation and a $100,000 donation. And I've seen that over and over and over again. And I think in this moment, it's especially important. And I have a question for Nathan later, is that I would love to know how you're thinking about, when we're thinking about this surplus and this, also how we're thinking about Columbia and NYU paying their fair share. And even if it's not through taxes, if there's other ways, and that's something I would love to explore.
You're going to lunch with.
Yeah, because I'm like, that is also a surplus that if they were doing what Yale was doing in New Haven, that we would have in order to be able to close some of these gaps that are coming. But
you know, it's fascinating as you talk, Justin. I couldn't help but think back to our days in the Bloomberg administration when we were doing the work of the Commission for Economic Opportunity and even the Racial Justice Commission work. You know, there was a time when we understood that cities were a place for everybody. And it was, you know, people moved to the suburbs if they wanted to have more, and I don't mean this in a negative, I'm not casting aspersions upon people who live in the community. I should. But it was like you wanted to be like in this tight community, people more like you. You know, if one family was paying $25,000 in taxes for property, then that meant that everybody who was there could pretty much pay $25,000 or more in taxes. And so you were with like people. And what the community, what the city represented, and I'm not saying it's not a negative. I lived in the suburbs, so I'm not saying it's but in the city, it was, you know, you got on the subway and every socioeconomic demographic was represented on the subway, and that's what made New York City beautiful. Yes. She's talking about the MTA poster where it's like all the different faces and right, and we're losing that in this city because it's becoming increasingly unaffordable. And the question maybe becomes, how do you join those desires, those beliefs about who we are and what we should be? In Paris, I remember reading in Paris that they have in their charter that 1/3 of the city shall always remain accessible via housing for the lowest income. So that is a commitment that they make as a city. And they work towards that because they believe that all people should be able to live and thrive in that urban metropolis. Maybe that's what we should be talking to the Charter Revision Commission about. I saw one more hand, and then I think we're going to be wrapping.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Joshua. I'm from Greater New York. I first want to praise Krista. Your comptroller office does incredible work, and one of the pieces that I think you released last month was talking about the true gap in payment delays. I think something like $15 billion in previous year money that had to be reallocated. It was wild. And I bring that up because thinking about a lot of what people are saying, like who is benefiting, who would benefit from different policy, different fiscal policy, things like that. I wonder to the panelists what you think the perfect role for the business sector would be in advocating on behalf of the people. I think it was in 2021, we started to see a lot of the like forever scaffolding and sheds come down across the city. And a lot of that happened because the business sector came and did studies with, I don't know if it was MasterCard or Citibank, and said like, we're losing money because we're losing money because people are not coming into our businesses. And that pushed this administration to make those changes. So to you all, if you could talk, just, you know, I hate the wave magic wand questions, but if you could wave a magic wand and say, business sector, corporate sector, focus on this one issue, what would that one issue be that you would want businesses to advocate for us?
Thank you for your comments. I think it was our Contracts Administration Bureau that put that out, and they are amazing. I'm not sure there's one thing, but I think the first thing that does come to mind is the importance of immigrants to the city for the business community. But I think more broadly, just kind of what you were saying about the city, the vitality of the city, how everything is so interconnected, the public transit, immigration, the clean air and parks and tourism. So the tariffs are going to have a huge impact on New York City. And sort of to America's point of just, we're all in this together, but it is for their sake that they need to be speaking up and talking about the benefits of all of this to them, that it's not the other that is receiving this. It is the business community that receives these benefits as much, if not more, than everybody else.
So has there been any conversation about the triple squeeze? Has there been any conversation about the triple squeeze of nonprofits who are owed substantially from city, state, and now federal, and what's going to be addressed?
I can start. We talk about it all the time, and the Comptroller's Office, again, the Contracts Bureau is responsible for the registration piece, and they're the only part of the contract process that has a timeline attached to it. They have to do it within 30 days, and I think it's like 2 weeks on average that they meet their deadline, but they're the only part, and so we do have a lot of conversation about how to shed light on what the issues are. We've asked for more detail. We will talk about it at the next roundtable, because I think, what I've been hearing is from some of my former colleagues that now run nonprofits, it was the federal government that was kind of the steady payer. And now that is at risk, it really exacerbates this issue that has been going on with the city. So I think, we are acutely aware of it. I think, unfortunately, it does have to be the mayoral administration that looks at those processes. So those should be questions you're asking the next mayor, for sure.
So I agree with Krista, but I also want to point out that there are 2 charter revision commissions going on right now. The mayoral charter revision commission, which legally trumps the other one, that's not the right verb, and also a city council one, which is called like the Democracy Commission. They have public hearings once a week. You can go testify. The IBO has testified. I have testified at both, and part of the testimony is that the city is holding an incredible financial risk because of not paying its bills on time, and needs to figure out how to do that faster. That's both a management issue, but there are also changes that can be made in the charter. And so it's one place where, how the city's law is structured, the commissions that change that are inviting public input.
And I'll end on this just in response to what you all said is, for me, it always comes back to whether it should or shouldn't. It's just the lens through which I see things and filter. We have to remember that this is a sector that was created Well, let's go back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Government is a responsive body, a reactive body, right? And so they call themselves reacting to a crisis. But we've got to remember that there was a point in time when services paid for by the government were very much based on race and religion. And people who were of a darker hue were considered less than and not as worthy. And we had to rely significantly upon Black-led institutions, mainly Black women-led institutions, to take care of Black children and Black mothers and families. Bring that forward, we know that we are still grappling with racism and inequality, misogyny and sexism, and we know that those are the two most effective tools for upholding structural economic deprivation. So we have to remember that when we are fighting on behalf of human service agencies and the people for whom they care, that we're still caught up in a system. When the contracts are not being paid, maybe it's a process issue, but there's something underlying that we can't figure this out. Now, for not just 3-4 years, there's an underlying element, in my estimation, in my opinion, of this whole what we've given deservedness and who's worthy and who's not. And even the people caring for people in need. You know, what's that? I get so sick, and I'm sure each of us have experienced this, when somebody introduces you and says, oh, this person could be working anywhere, but they've chosen to be a servant. Like it is less than. This is the narrative that attends. So even when people are in spaces trying to figure out how to get people paid timely, how to get organizations caring for people who are challenged, the bias is real. And we've got to cut through that too. You all have been incredible this morning. And these individuals who are sitting up here, we just can't thank you enough for the work that you're doing, the time that you're giving to us, helping us to gain knowledge and with it gain power. My hope is that you all will lean into their respective work and activities in addition to, visiting FPWA's website and learning more about the tracker. Visit the Independent Budget Office's website, Fiscal Policy Institute, what's happening with the Comptroller's Office, and of course, Brooklyn.org, and learn about what they're doing in this moment. We're going to stay engaged. We're going to talk about civic engagement. We're just here to do the work. We did not come here with all of the answers. But part of developing answers is engaging in the critical thinking and dialogue that produces those necessary answers. Fair? Thanks for being here and have a good afternoon.